Dr. Jimmy Brown here. First of all, thanks so much for stopping by. Hope you enjoyed today's video. I do have one quick request. Please be sure to like, subscribe as I'm trying to grow the channel. And if you have any topics you want me to cover, please be sure to shoot me a note and let me know. I'll put them in the queue. Can't promise how fast I'll get to them, but hey, I'm looking for ways to help everybody out who visits. So that's it. Hope all is well. Hope you enjoyed today's topic. Hey everybody, Dr. Jimmy Brown here. Make a new video for you. And to be honest, today's video is probably going to get me in trouble here at home. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually be sharing with you something that's a little bit embarrassing, at least to my wife. And that is that sometimes I watch stupid TV shows. So full disclosure, some of you guys who know me from class know I work for a number of schools, do a bunch of coaching. So I have a lot of time to watch stuff. So really, unless it's like a SEC football game or I'm watching MLS or Premier League soccer with my son, I usually don't watch much TV except for maybe after midnight on Fridays and Saturday nights, but the only time I really get to, because I've got multiple jobs and 2 kids and a lot of folks are just really busy. One of the shows I do watch though, because it's kind of hilarious, is a show called Ancient Aliens. When it comes on sometimes, because one, I love science fiction, keyword, fascinated by archaeology, love science, and as a researcher, when you watch that show, it's kind of hilarious how they come to some of their conclusions. When you think about when we think about the ideas of trustworthiness in research, it's a great example of some of the things we shouldn't do and some of the ways we can help avoid falling the same traps. So today's presentation is going to use that as a what do you call it? Just use that as kind of an example of that. And that's the basis of what we're doing. Now, another full disclosure, a couple of pictures here. I'm not sure about the rights on them, but this is made for education purposes. So we're going to claim fair use and hope, and as small as this channel is, hopefully it won't be an issue. So first thing we'll talk about is, what does trustworthiness mean in research? So when we think about reliability and validity and trustworthiness in research, what we're getting into here is basically, can we be confident that what we're being presented with? So when we think about quantitative research, towards to come up with things like reliability and validity. Reliability being the repeatability of the measure, validity being is the instrument actually measuring what it says it does. There's also the question of things like the representatives of the sample, power analysis, sample error estimate, things like that. Those are all things we typically use in quantitative research to say, you know what, this population, this data is representative of what is real in the world. In trustworthiness, what we're really getting into is, can we trust that the results come from the data and not from researcher biases or researchers just making stuff up? It is typically more assigned, like in doctoral dissertations, around things like qualitative research versus quant, but it can be used across other areas. But really, it's the same thing of, can I trust that this is what is really going on? When we think about trustworthiness in research, there's 4 main categories we look at. And if you look across various different sources, it looks at credibility, which is how well the findings accurately represent the experiences of the other subjects. Dependability, which is really the degree to which the research procedures are documented and reliable. Some might even say repeatable. Particularly in quant, we look at repeatable. In qual, repeatability is not as big of an issue, because it's rare to have qualitative studies repeated as much, but it is still a thing of, can I redo this somewhere else and get a result I'm as confident in? Transferability is the degree to which they're applicable to some policy or practice, really the generalizability of the results. So if I do a study that looks at, say, kids in an urban school district, a qualitative study, am I relatively confident that if I look at a very similar population, it would be have a similar result, but for maybe the different location or something like that? And confirmability, which is, if somebody looks back through my findings, can they make sense of how I got to my results? If you've had me as a doctoral dissertation student or in a qualitative research class or as an AQR reviewer or quality reviewer rather, you'll know that I'm always looking at, what's that data, and can I see that chain of custody from raw data to codes to categories to themes. In fact, I'm going to make a few videos coming up shortly about that topic. And finally, it's really a question of, it's important for qualitative research because one of the goals, again, is to show that the data is from the the subjects, not from our own biases and expectations and desired outcomes. So, how do we apply this to ancient aliens? So, if you watch that show, and this is the same for if you've seen that new one called The Unexplained with William Shatner, or there's a bunch of other knockoffs of that on like Side Channel and Discovery Channel and some other things like that. They're always pointing out the fact there's a lot of things about ancient history we can't explain. So, for example, look at Stonehenge. Those stones were quarried like 200 something miles away, and they've had a hard time explaining how that got to be where it is today. When we look at, say, the Sphinx in Egypt, there is the issue that if you look at this guy, Robert Schoch, who's a geologist in Boston, and he's identified that the weather in the Sphinx looks more like rain coming down over centuries. And there hasn't been rain in that part of the world in at least the last 12,000 years. And also the size of the Sphinx heads actually had a proportion for the body. And there's several different, some points where some of the documentation we have on the Sphinx from ancient Egypt, depending upon the translation, it may say repaired versus built. When Khufu supposedly either built or repaired, depending on how you do the translation, they think, okay, that's not quite, we can't quite explain that. There's also things with ancient pyramid, with the pyramids, about where, there's never really been, they say there are burial chambers. There's not really anything, never been any burial things found in them. There's other burial chambers in the Valley of the Kings, not far away. So some things don't quite add up. But, there's some things that don't quite add up. And you have to accept some things with Mason archaeology that we haven't been able to explain yet. And finally, of course, UFOs. There are people who see things in the sky they can't explain. There are some things like when the Romans invaded Scotland, they talk about seeing like flying shields. Alexander the Great supposedly saw one at one point. There are some things in history that we can't explain. And when you study history and you see that over time, stories and narrative change, it becomes easier to understand. But what happens is you get people like this guy, and again, apologies to History Channel for using their pick, but we're going to call it fair use since it's for education purposes, who say, oh my gosh, it must have been ancient aliens. Was it? We can't disprove that it was, but there is no definitive evidence to say that it was. This is much like in qualitative research where people will say, oh, I did this study, interviewed these people, it must have been caused by X program. Even though maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, we can't prove it. Or if a researcher, I was doing somebody a while back recently who they were very in favor of this particular program at the school they were working at. They did interviews with a bunch of folks who said it was great. The problem was the people they interviewed were all people who are also advocates for the program. So they weren't really looking at things to confirm or disconfirm. And their chain of custody on the data, they had all the codes from their data. Then they jumped to a conclusion. There was nothing really in between. So how do we as researchers sound more like good researchers and not like the folks off Ancient Aliens? Let's start with the ideas of how to increase credibility. And I'm going to post these slides in PDF down below that you can download them if you want to. There's a few of these. One of them is, starting off with inquiry from an established knowledge base. If you're doing a dissertation, you're doing a research study, what does the current lit say about something, right? I saw a study a while back, and they were saying there was no research on how organizational culture impacts organizational performance. I've been an organizational psychologist now for, almost 30 years, if you count when I started in grad school. And no, it's pretty clearly established that the culture of an organization does that. There's a question one time about, we don't know if family engagement impacts student success. No, we do know that. So when you start off a qualitative study that's not based on knowledge base, that's a pretty big thing. Narrative truth. The researcher takes actions to look at how the participants' experiences are reflected. Triangulation. This is actually important if you do a case study. If you've seen my video on the different types of qualitative designs, in a case study, if you go to Robert Yin's work, you're supposed to do triangulation. What that means is, say you've got a set of interviews over here with one group, and instead of interviews over here with another group, instead of interviews with another group, how do those result? You analyze each of them separately, then you compare the results. Or you might have interviews and focus groups, or interviews and a survey. It all depends. I had a study a while back where a guy did a case study with 3 sets of interviews with students who studied in South America, Asia, and Europe, and compared their experiences. That was how we triangulate. Increased dependability, the audit trail. How do you show how you went from one piece to another? Clear alignment between those pieces. Test the strengths of the analysis through interpretation. We mentioned member checking the last slide, comparing it to the existing lit. You know, one of the things I always get into is when we look at our results, do they challenge, support, or extend the existing literature? And if we can show what it does, if it challenges, we can say why it challenged. If it supports it, say why it supports it. Extend it, say why it extends it. Those are the kinds of things we look for. How to increase transferability? Thick, deep descriptions. One of the things that people often get confused about in qualitative research is what's a thick description. Your interviews should be at least a half hour. If you're looking for knowledge or narrative, sometimes a couple hours. Really thick depth in the experience. Sampling sufficiency. One of the mistakes a lot of people make, and I'm actually going to make a video about this later, is saying they're going to, oh, I'm going to do saturation. Well, saturation is not required for any qualitative research, but for ground theory. Saturation also can't be predicted up front. You can't say, I'm going to get 10 people and get saturation. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But realistically, if you do saturation properly, by Patricia Fuchs, her work she did, you've got to have a lot of stuff to really say that you have saturation, and then you got to collect a couple more to make sure you still have that. I know one guy, most time for most proper like ground theory studies, you're doing 25 to 30 people at least. Very rarely have fewer. I know one guy, he had to do, I think he had to do 67 interviews, if I remember correctly, to hit saturation. How do we increase confirmability? Again, things like intercoded reliability, have other people's coded, rival explanations of narrative cases. One of the ways that we make a really strong, trustworthy qualitative research is to show that we found things that didn't support what we wanted. There's a lady named Penny Murray. She did a study in 2015, I think that's when we published it. Go look it up. She graduated from Walden in 2015 that I chaired, and she did a study that what she found was very different than what she expected. If you want to go look it up, I'll leave the info below in the comments. I won't get into what the study was about, but I will say what she found was so different from what she expected, and so different from the prevailing narrative that there were some folks at the school who challenged it. And I actually had to get the dean involved to say, look, we're passing this through because this is actually what she found, and we can find it from her lit, or from her data, excuse me. Recognizing the shortcomings of your method. If you say, you know what, I was going to do 20 interviews, I only was able to get 15. That's a shortcoming. You recognize it. If you say, you know what, I realized as I was interviewing people, all the folks I was interviewing came from a background that's super supportive of the ideas I was pushing. We recognize that. All studies have biases. All studies have shortcomings. When we recognize those, that makes it more trustworthy. So that's really about it. If you have questions, shoot me a note. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And again, what we're trying to do here is say, you know what, let's be like good quality researchers. While again, Ancient Aliens, while it's entertaining to watch and there's some funny stuff there, we don't want to be like those guys. We want to be like the good, solid folks who say, you know what, I've got data. Here's what I went to. Maybe it got me where I didn't want to go. I don't know, but you can trust that. So that's it. Hope all is well. And we will talk to you next time.